Thanks, Mike. And so, for a bit of context here, I want to start by setting the table before we dive into some of the fundamental theory to understand with the reserve study. But I've been giving reserve study presentations for 17 years, and I think that basic, what is a reserve study type of presentation, I've probably seen that about 1,000,000 times at CAI seminars and other seminars. So I didn't want to spend the whole half hour going through information that I think most people already have a relative understanding of. Now, with that said, I do think that even the basic understanding of the reserve study has some pretty big misconceptions. And that's one of my goals today, is to strip away those misconceptions with reserve studies, because those misconceptions, I think they create all kinds of confusion, and in some cases even dissatisfaction with reserve studies. In some cases, the misconceptions about reserve studies cause people to discount the value of the reserve study, their confidence, their belief in the reserve study to be accurate, or even their motivation to implement and to fund the reserve study. Those are all important things, so that's what I wanted to dive into deeper than just that basic what is a reserve study. Now, I feel compelled to throw out a disclaimer first, because I was the director of client services for another legacy reserve study provider from 2004 to 2014. So in that decade, I got a ton of feedback from clients all across the country about things they liked about reserve studies, but also a lot of things that they didn't like. And my goal today isn't to throw shade on the industry, even though there's some providers that deserve it, but it's really to acknowledge that historically there was some valid reasons for people to question the results of the reserve study, to be dissatisfied. But that's why I left my prior company to start Superior Reserve, to address some of the shortcomings that I saw with reserve studies. But even with how we perform reserve studies differently, I think there's still some fundamental misconceptions about reserve studies that if we dispel those, it would truly help board members maximize the value of their reserve study, deal with homeowners' objections and concerns, and overall make it easier to manage your association affairs. And that's really key to all of this. You don't have professional management. It's the purpose of professional management is to make your organization, your association easier to function, to save you time as a board member, because you guys don't get paid. You're donating your valuable time because you want to protect your investment and see your community do well. But it's not equitable for you to invest that inordinate amount of your time, and that's time you could be playing golf, or time you could be working and getting paid, or time you could be sitting on your patio with your cocktail, feet in the air and a cocktail in your hand. So it's not equitable that you invest inordinate amounts of your time so that other people in the community can enjoy that, quote, carefree living of a condominium at your expense. So that's what professional management does. It reduces your time investment, spreads the cost of that over your entire association ownership. And the assistance of outside consultants like reserve consultants does the same thing. It reduces that burden of you as a volunteer board member, and the cost of that time-saving consultant is then shared by everyone through their fees and assessments. So that's equitable, and that's a core principle of reserve planning that I'm going to talk about today, is equitable. And stating that differently, I mean it's making it fair. And when I say making it fair, that sounds a little bit juvenile, but it's true. I mean, fairness matters. People like fair, and people agree to fair. And there are always those people in life who think success is taking advantage of others, but I think that's really a small percent. I think most people are perfectly willing and desiring to participate in things that they think are fair. And it's cliche to say, but again, like win-win. And with that said, even when it's not necessarily win-win, more of a give and take, people will still participate in processes that they perceive to be fair. I mean, think about two teams deciding to compete in a sporting contest. They know someone's going to come out ahead, someone's going to lose, but if the process is fair, they're okay with that. So with that stated, I just wanted to set that table with that quick summary of what I call, or I want to start with what I call the reserve study basics. So you can flip to the first slide, Mike, and we'll jump into these. And again, when I say reserve study basics, I want to move through this quickly because I think most people have a fundamental understanding of reserve studies. But for our purposes here, even for people understand, I want to recapture some of that and start. Common property. The core function of an association is maintaining common property. From a fiscal standpoint, from a business-like standpoint, I mean, that's why you have an association. It's right, that's it. I mean, the common property, there's not a big need for an association if you didn't have common property. I mean, and it's true that some associations have no common property, just the association enforces the visual, architectural control type things. It's a more restrictive set of guidelines than municipal ordinances, but those kind of associations that it's where there is no common property, property, they don't have a need for a reserve study, so they're kind of dead to me. But I mean, I'm kidding, but I live in one of those associations where they're single family homes, but there's still an association here. But we don't have common property, so we don't need a reserve study. There's nothing to assess for a reserve study. But on that fiscal level, there's two sides to your association. You've got your operating budget, your annual operating budget that you work from every year. And so from that, you have a pretty good idea of a pretty good handle because it's annual. So what you spend last year is an approximate guide for what you'll spend the following year. And then the other side is the capital reserve budget. And that's the stuff that doesn't come up very often. And again, I'm moving through this fast because these are the reserve study basics that I want to get past and dig into some theory here that'll help you guys. So stuff that doesn't come up very often, roofs, I mean, once every 15 to 25 years, parking lots, private roads. That's what the reserve providers focus on and specialize in, is the common elements. and those are often ignored for the reason that you can ignore them. You can ignore for a long period of time these assets that only need to be replaced once every 10 years, once every 15 years, once every 20 years, and some assets even longer, their useful life. So for a period of time, you can ignore many of those elements, but unfortunately, as every association will eventually find out, that'll come back to haunt you. And that's the side we're going to talk about here today, is the capital reserve side. So next slide, if you could, Mike. So core purpose, and again, not the only purpose of a reserve study, but the core purpose of a reserve study is the capital reserve budget, and is saying how much should we be assessing unit owners. I mean, that's why you want to do a reserve study, because you want to take the right amount to put into reserves. That's, again, not the only reason for a reserve study, but the primary reason. So I'm going to run through the process here quickly of the reserve study. And the first is to identify common elements. What's the association responsible for? Are the roads public or private? Are the decks the homeowner's responsibility or the association's responsibility? That's the first piece, the first stage of a reserve study. Second part, on-site, evaluating the common elements. Spill some dirty little secrets of the industry here. Historically, a lot of firms in the industry, they do what they call drive-by reserve studies. And I steal that term when I say drive-by from banks, who, if you're familiar with the drive-by appraisals, drive-by, take pictures, look up for a bank, drive-by, take pictures, look up comparable sales on a computer, and bam, there's the value of a house. For reserve studies, drive-by, take pictures and measurements, and then everything's based upon average lives. Stand on the ground, take a picture of the roof, ask the manager, the board member how old they are, and since the average life for a roof is 20 years, if it's 15 years old, boom, 5 years from now, that's the replacement date. Now, we do things differently at Superior Reserve. We go up on roofs with ladders, but make a much more targeted judgment of actual condition, but that's part of that second piece, is the inspection. And so when we talk about the reserve study process, that's where we go next, is the inspection. Then back office stuff takes place, analysis, calculations of replacement costs, calculations of replacement dates. In a minute, I'm going to dive into the replacement costs. And I already gave you a little insight into the difference in how replacement dates are arrived at. There's average lives, or there's going by condition, two different ways to come at replacement dates. But replacement costs involve some key misconceptions. So I want to dig into those in the next slide. But for now, finishing up the process here of reserve study, a reserve report's then created, provided to a client. There's sometimes discussion, maybe even a final report. And again, I'm breezing through this quickly. But I include the word equitable here because we're going to dive into that as well. And the study goal is to have an equitable plan. It's a fair plan, a plan by which the appropriate person who consumed the value of an asset is covering the expense of that asset. So that's the basics for a reserve study. And now we're going to dive deep and go into mastering your reserve study. And next slide, Mike. So replacement costs. Now, if I told you that I was all-knowing and that I had a crystal ball and I looked into it and I knew exactly what you're going to spend on all of your future projects for your association, every single one of them, I know them to the penny. What are you going to write the check for when the time comes for the next 30 years? Because that's the time frame of a reserve study, looking out 30 years. Some people would say, awesome. I mean, that sounds like a perfect reserve study. That's what we're hoping for when we do a reserve study. But I'm here to tell you that a reserve study that would predict exactly what you're going to spend, the money that you're actually going to send out the door in that check for all these projects, would be a terrible reserve study. And when I tell people that, they scratch their head and they think to themselves, wait a minute, that's the whole reason we're doing a reserve study. We want to predict these future expenditures. So that if we did that, that would be a terrible reserve study for your unit owners and terrible for your association. And so a good reserve study needs to determine what's equitable reserve contributions, not actual future, not actual future expenditures, but equitable reserve contributions. And that gets lost on some people. And I mean, heck, it even gets lost on some inexperienced reserve providers. But to explain this, we don't know what a future board is going to do. You know, future board might have different priorities than the current board. We don't know what kinds of products and technology might exist in the future. We don't know what laws and regulations might be in the future, and that might affect what, for example, what we put on roofs of homes and of buildings. So I want to start with an example to drive this point home, that you don't want a study that actually predicts perfectly what you're going to spend in the future. There's a reason for that. So I'm going to start with an example, and that'll make the point, and then we'll talk more on the concept afterwards. So let's say that my engineer goes up on the roofs of your buildings, not standing on the ground taking pictures, but actually goes up on the roof and determines that your roofs, they're 5 years old, so they've got 20 years of life left. So 2041 is when your roofs are in the study to be replaced. Now, we have no idea what people are going to be putting on roofs in 20 years. Maybe it's going to be asphalt shingles like it is now. Maybe a future board's going to decide that they just love the look of metal roofs. Or maybe the government's going to come down and mandate that every roof has Elon Musk's Tesla shingles. I don't know if you've heard of these, but they're BIPVs, building integrated photovoltaic. They're asphalt, or excuse me, they're solar panel shingles that go on the roofs of homes, generate electricity and reduce your electricity cost. So metal roof or solar panel roof, they're going to cost way more money than an asphalt shingle roof. I mean, way more money. You know, metal roofs, they're more money, but they're supposed to last a whole bunch longer. Solar panel shingles, they're going to cost a whole bunch more, but they're supposed to return energy savings. So it reduces, you're spending more on a roof, but saving money on electricity. But then you have to ask yourself, who's going to, let's say we do solar panel shingles, who's going to enjoy that cost savings? So you think, shouldn't a reserve study predict, if we're going to have to do solar panel shingles in the future, shouldn't the reserve study predict that? I mean, that's what we're going to have to do. And we want the reserve study to be accurate. We're trying to prevent special assessments here. But you have to ask yourself, who's going to enjoy those energy savings? And what cost should the study have for roof replacement in 2041? If you put in the cost for solar panel shingle roofs, everybody's fees are going to go way up, and I mean way up right now, because the reserve study is going to calculate assessments to meet that expenditure. And so you're reserving money to replace roofs with a roof that's going to cost 5 times as much as an asphalt shingle roof. But then you have to ask yourself, why should today's unit owners be paying higher fees for 20 years for a solar roof that's going to go in the future, that's going to save future owners all kinds of money and energy savings? That's not equitable. So that's why this is one example of where the reserve study shouldn't try to predict what you're actually going to spend. And that's an extreme example when we talk about something like solar panel shingles. But think about even like metal roofs. Those are more expensive. And should the reserve study be trying to collect money for that? And the answer is no, because it's not equitable, but it's also not feasible. You know, most unit owners on average live in a condo unit for 6 years. That's the average. And of course, some people live for much longer, some people live in a condo for much longer. But the average is 6 years. So think about all the other projects that are going to be in a reserve study. Building lighting. Building lighting, you're going to replace lighting. You look at the vendor catalog. A future board, let's say lighting is 8 years in the future. Future board comes, vendor comes in with catalogs. They look at all the lights. Now the lights that you have in the building, maybe that was the developer grade fixtures, which is all, you know, we know what that means. And maybe those were $20 a fixture. Then you get this vendor catalog, and here's fixtures that are $20 a fixture. They're kind of like the ones you have, but here's fixtures that are $150 a fixture. They're beautiful, they're LED, they're light motion sensing. I mean, but those are $150 a fixture. Think of carpeting. There's carpeting that you have in the building now. Maybe it's $9 a square yard, but you can look at carpeting from a catalog, and here's carpet, it's $30 a square yard. So entry systems, maybe right now your building has keys, or maybe you have key fobs, but everybody now is going to biometrics and smart entry systems, some that work through phones, some that work through facial recognition. I mean, that's like the new latest, greatest thing. Those are super expensive to install, way more expensive than rekeying the building. So think about mechanical equipment, better boilers, more efficient boilers, more those kind of things, more expensive but more energy efficient. So those are all future projects. And if the reserve study included all of those upgrades that an association might actually make, many of which are many, many years in the future, the monthly assessments for your association are going to be crazy high because you're reserving money to improve the roof, you're reserving money to improve the entry system, you're reserving money to put in better carpet. So the fees are going to be crazy high in that building. Monthly assessment's crazy high. Everybody's going to be paying high fees, for example, for assets that they may never even enjoy. And then the existing assets in the property wouldn't justify them. Do you want today's unit owners trying to sell their units with these super high fees, but yet the assets don't justify it? So this is why you want the reserve study to project costs in like kind to what exists now, because you don't want your reserve study to be collecting money for upgrades, and for all the reasons that I previously described and gave examples of. So in reality, this is a term that I use. I often describe reserve contributions not as paying for a future asset, but you're contributing to the reserve for the consumption of life of the assets that exist today. That's the way that I phrase it. And once homeowners and board members think of it that way, yeah, we're contributing money for the consumption of life. I'm living under this roof for 1 year. I'm contributing for a year's worth of consumption of life for this roof. Because indeed, we don't know what your association will actually spend on all these future projects, but we do know exactly what you have today. We know exactly what kind of roof is on your building, and then we're making that specific judgment of how long that will last, not an average life, but we think that's got 10 years left. So we know what it's going to cost, what you're consuming of the useful life of that. So again, we don't know what you're going to have in the future, but we know exactly what you have today. And so we calculate the costs based upon what you're consuming. And that's today's assets. So now you can see why reserve studies, well, first off, if you're then basing a projection in the reserve study strictly off of average lives, that's not equitable either, because it doesn't matter if your replacement cost is perfect projected to the penny, but if the replacement date is off by 5 years, because maybe the average life for an asset is 5 years, but your asset's going to last 25 because the average might be 15 to 25 for a particular asset. And so if the average is 20 years and it's 5 years in the future, but the real life is 10 more years, you've got double the time to reserve for that. So that's why the critical part of the reserve study is accurately assessing remaining life of assets. And that's why one of the things that our firm specializes in. So the next question I often get from board members is, if the reserve study doesn't account for what we're actually going to spend, then aren't we going to have a shortfall in funding? I mean, aren't we going to run out of money? And so there's an answer there too. Now, maybe for a huge upgrade, if you indeed are going to put solar panel shingles on the roof instead of asphalt shingles in the future, that might be something that, when the time comes, they may say, look, we've got money in reserves to replace with asphalt shingles, but we're going to go to solar panel shingles. But as soon as we do, your electric bills are going to zero. So then maybe they say, we're going to do a special assessment to pay for the cost, not for the whole roof, but for the increased cost of the solar panel shingles. And so some associations do decide to do a special assessment for that, because as soon as those new solar panel shingles go on, everybody's electricity bills go down to zero. And so, and again, maybe it's not zero, but cut 75, 80%. So, but in other situations, you'll actually have enough money in the reserve study, as long as you aren't in your critical funding year. Think about that. Most of the time, you'll have more in your reserve account than you're going to need in that particular year, or even in the next couple of years. So you can spend more out of the reserve than the reserve was accumulating for that particular project. The reserve study said $100,000 for roof replacement, but you're going to upgrade the roof to solar panels, so it's going to be $400,000. If you've got the money in reserves, go ahead and spend it. But that's a reason, that's an extreme example. But let's say you're going to do an improvement with light fixtures. Instead of the $20 a fixtures, you're going to go to $50 a fixture. So you're going to spend several $1,000s more. Go ahead and spend it, because the reserve fund has enough money in there for that. And then that's the reason that people then would update their reserve study, because they've made these upgrades. And now that the new assets exist, now we want to do a reserve study update to bring fees up. So fees are going to go up, but we've got all these new assets in here, and we're enjoying these nicer assets. We're enjoying more efficient systems. We're enjoying a nicer carpet. The sale prices are going up because we have nicer carpet. When prospective buyers come through, they see the fees are this level, but they've got very nice finishes in the building. That's why the fees are a little higher than another building. So that's the examples. You want future owners, they're going to pay more for upgrades, but they're consuming those upgrades. So it works out, and that's where that equitable comes in. Even in the critical funding years, if your association is at that lowest point in their reserves, there's still a slight buffer that's put in there, so you can overspend the reserve. But that's why when some people say that reserve study is a good reserve study will prevent special assessments, and again, it's not necessarily true, because a special assessment may in some cases be the most equitable way to fund a future replacement. Now, on the other hand, if the association replaces things in like kind, then future unit owners, they're going to be paying about the same as you were, because they're enjoying the same level of finishes, same kind of assets that you were. One caveat here is if there's a near-term expenditure, like let's say you do a reserve study in 2021, and in 2022 you're already planning to replace all the carpet, then we'd have a conversation as a consultant, and we would say, maybe we should talk about upgrades here, because you're probably, do you guys think you're going to upgrade the carpet? Because then you don't want to update your reserve study, 1 year from when you do it. So let's think about maybe putting what you're actually going to spend in the reserve study, a more realistic number, if we expect that you would upgrade the carpet, because that would, then you don't have to update the reserves in next year. Fees are going to be higher next year when the carpet goes in, but everybody's going to be there enjoying. Most people will still be here next year. So if it's someone pays higher fees for a couple months before the new carpet goes in, again, that's equitable. So, looking at my notes here, see if I missed anything on that topic. Key thing to point out here is sometimes some useful information to understand when you critique your reserve study is how these numbers are calculated, but also sometimes vendors will see or be told what's in the reserve study for a cost for a project by the association. And the vendor might say, like your vendor who's going to replace your entry systems, like your life safety systems, they'll say, you don't have enough in your reserve to do, these systems now cost, $80,000 and you've only got 30,000 in your reserves. And it's important for the board to understand, yeah, we didn't have the full cost because that's not equitable. We don't want unit owners for 5 years paying higher fees for a nicer entry system, for this biometric entry system, when they're still using keys or key fobs. So that's just something to understand. That doesn't mean you can't still do the upgrade, but that's why sometimes people say, my contractor looked at this and they said that this isn't enough for this particular asset. And that's by design. So, but moreover, when you have unit owners that are expressing objections, maybe in challenging the premise of the reserve study, now you're armed with information about how these numbers are really arrived at. And that's what I want to talk about in the next slide. If you could flip one more slide here, Mike. So that's objection handling. I hear these all the time. You might hear unit owners say, when I talk about increasing fees to put into the reserve, you'll hear unit owners saying, I don't want to pay for someone else's roof. That's not fair. But that's where, again, we're back to that concept to tell the unit owners, you're really paying for the consumption of the life of the roof that you're living under. And if it's monthly assessments, every month you're only contributing a month's worth to the capital fund. So if you live there 5 years, you haven't paid for someone else's roof, you've contributed 5 years worth of the consumption of life of the roof that you're living under. Live there 20 years, you'll have paid 20 years worth of the consumption of the life of the roof that you lived under, not the next roof, which might be an upgrade or it might be even in like kind, but then that future homeowner is going to pay for that consumption. And that makes sense, because think about it in a single family home. If you lived in there and the roof was 15 years old, someone's going to need to be replaced in 5 years. The purchaser is going to take that into consideration when they make their offer to purchase. You're going to get slightly less than the sale price. So you can't do that with a condominium, because there's so many assets there. How would a home inspector is not going to be able to say, look, these assets are all aged, you should offer less for this unit. Well, you're not going to do how much less? Well, we don't know. You'd have to do a reserve study to determine how much less to offer for a unit in consideration of these capital spends. So that's why it's different than a single family home. A single family home, you actually are paying for things, in a single family home, you're not contributing to a reserve, but you're actually paying for that in a lower sale price for things that are very aged. So the concept is actually the same, even though in a single family home, you're not capturing that money in a reserve fund. In a single family home, you'll pay for it with the final price of the building that will take that into consideration, any assets near their end of their useful life. So same, and the next one here I had, how do we even know what a roof will cost in 20 years? People will say, 20 years, maybe we have to put solar panels on the roofs here, because I've heard that one too, and that's where I use that example. You can say to people, we're not reserving for solar panel replacements. That'll be dealt with in the future. We're contributing for the consumption of life of the assets that exist here now, and we know exactly what those are. Next slide, Mike. So this is important because as you undertake the reserve study, you want to be aware of these things. I call this the reserve study mindset. Obviously, as a consultant, it's our job when we come in to make clients aware of these things as they're going through this process, but I'm going to share them with you now so you'll be ahead of the game. And so this is, and you'll have to excuse my language, but when I talk about this concept, I talk about the 3 lists. And the 3 lists, when I talk about reserve study mindset, are the shopping list, the shit list, and the real list. Let me explain what those are. So the shopping list, when we've observed this over and over, when boards go to do their reserve study, they view it, the reserve study consultants here, we want to get everything in the reserve study. I even have boards that say, yeah, we really think we want to go with solar panel shingles. I've got a client in South Carolina who's like, yeah, we're really keen on energy savings. We want to go solar panel shingles. It's a shopping list. Put everything in there, put everything in there. And then all of a sudden, when they get the study, so that's the shopping list mentality. Then the boards get the study, and then they see that they have to fund all these things. They go to budget. So when the study's being conducted, it's a shopping list. We want the beautiful new metal roof. We want the fancy biometric entry system. Think, let's put all this in there so we got the money to do that. But then you get the study, and then you go to budget, and that's when it's the shit list. You're like, oh man, these fees are too high. The board members won't make it out of their meeting alive, back to their units alive, but we need to cut costs. And so then the mentality changes. And this is important for boards to understand. Once you, on the front side, everybody thinks, let's get everything in there. And then they get the study and they see that this relates to dollars that are going to come out of our pockets and other unit owners' pockets. And it's like, oh shit. And so that's why I call it the shit list. That's the second mentality. Now, example, then the boards start thinking, as they're thinking about these fee increases that the unit owners are going to see, okay, let's overlay the roof instead of tear it off. Let's push off carpet replacement. Let's only replace the center strip of the main drive that's deteriorated. That's, again, now think of how much the mentality has changed from when you were doing the study initially to now when you're thinking about putting these numbers in and budgeting. And so then the last mindset that I talk about, and I had to use a play on words here to get the alliteration with my list terms, is the realist. So if your reserve study provides details on the project details themselves, like what's involved in this roof project, what's involved in the masonry project, you'll be able to critique the bids. You'll have a document that you can critique the bids, understand the scope of the work on the projects that our engineer projected. And the study is an objective expert opinion on these future projects. What is replacement in like kind? I use masonry as an example. When the facade of a building needs to be tuck pointed, it's not a cut and dry thing. Some facades need tuck pointing and they aren't in bad shape, but you want to keep up with it. You may only need to replace 2% of the bricks and 15% of the mortar joints need repointing. But on some facades, I mean, half the brick is spalled and you're going to need to repoint the whole thing. So this is when the reserve study is the realist. It's objective. What's an upgrade, what's not? What's a benchmark cost if we replace in like kind? Why is this bid so out of whack with the number in the reserve study? That's when the reserve study can provide this objective, realist information that'll help you through those projects. In the listing of the project, what's in this cost? If you have a mid-rise building, what's in this bathroom renovation? What's in there? Is that, if you see a number for $20,000 for bathroom renovations in our buildings or in the clubhouse or something, what is that? Well, then if you look at the detail, oh, that's new flooring, new countertops, new cabinets, it'll detail those information. So again, along with the cost, that's where that realist comes in. So updates. Industry line for updates is every 3 to 5 years. I mean, you go to any CAI seminar, they'll say that. I think that's a bit self-serving for reserve providers, but depending on the quality of a study, when a study is just based upon averages, then that is necessitated to update more frequently. But we tell most of our clients, every 5 to 7 years, you can update your reserve study unless other circumstances warrant it. And those other circumstances are those things that we talked about earlier, like when you've done upgrades. We've done a lot of upgrades to the building. We've improved the building. We put in nicer carpet. We put in nicer light fixtures. So we overspent the reserve. Now we want to do an update. We could do it because we had the money sitting in reserves, but we now want to do an update to bring the fees up to correspond so people are contributing enough and we don't run out of money for our next replacements. And we're now reserving for the assets that exist here today, which are nicer than the assets that existed here before. So other things like I was listening to a CIA webinar a month or so ago when someone asked about lumber prices and in the context of should we update our study, because like this year lumber prices have gone crazy, COVID disruptions, and then increased demand because of all the civil unrest and businesses around the country being boarded up, and just production production interruptions with the lumber industry. So lumber costs have gone through the roof. But if you're doing a roof project next year and you anticipate needing to redeck the roof, then yeah, these increased lumber costs might affect you. But over time, these things like lumber costs and other things, they tend to after they spike, they tend to return to a mean. They tend to return to an average. So if you look at your reserve study and say, hey, again, thinking about reasons to update, we don't have any lumber intense projects for 5 years, then even though lumber spiked this year, that's no reason to update your reserve study, because by the time that you actually get to your lumber intense projects in 5 years, lumber is probably going to be back down to the traditional historical level of cost. So just something to consider about reserve study updates and the reasons for doing those. Next slide, if you could, Mike. So we've got a couple slides here left. And this one, I could go into a long story, and we don't have time for that. So when I talk about I call it the vicious cycle of keeping fees low. I actually wrote an article about this that's been published this last quarter in a lot of the CAI magazines. So if anybody wants, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send that over. Or if you have the CAI magazine, this whole article is in there about this vicious cycle of keeping fees low. But now we get to that moment of truth. You've had the reserve study done. You understand the philosophy behind it. Now it's not a crystal ball, because that's not what you want from a reserve study. That would be taking way too much money from today's homeowners and really bloat your assessments. It's an equitable plan, but you have to fund it, and you need to go to every length possible to fund it. And I'm talking about 100%. Anything less than funding your reserve study 100% of what the study recommends is steering your association into a financial predicament. Now, there is discretion in the reserve study, and in our studies, we even highlight that. We say, hey, here's elements that are discretionary. You could choose to defer this one. Here's things that are firm. This really shouldn't be deferred. So you get that initial report, you see the numbers, you see where you'd have to set assessments, and you might say, we're going to push off a couple of these discretionary things that we can push off with. Maybe it's the furniture in the clubhouse, or maybe it's even light fixtures. They're going to look terrible before they start to fail. So you can push them off for many number of years. The finish looks terrible. So there's a lot of assets that are deferrable, and you can make that choice and then come up with a final plan that you're going to work with going forward. That's okay. That's kind of part of the process. But once you have that plan, this is the expenditures, this is when we're going to do them, and this is the funding that we need to meet those for replacement and like kind. You really have to fund that at 100%, because not doing that, you're leaving that pitfall in the future, that financial collapse. And I hear donors say all the time, we have a great board, we haven't raised fees in 10 years, and I always cringe, because costs increase, and that's a fact. And if you haven't increased your fees in 10 years, you're likely cutting back somewhere. And when I say cutting back somewhere, the most likely place that people cut back on when they're budgeting is the reserve account, because you can cut back in the reserves for a long time and it doesn't come back to bite you, because again, some of these expenditures, they don't take place for 10 years, 15 years. So you can cheat that reserve fund for a long time to keep your operating budget costs low and then keep your assessments low, but it's going to come back to haunt you. Curb appeal suffers. So when I talk about this vicious cycle, curb appeal suffers, then people who like the top condition properties, they move out because the curb appeals suffer. Look, the board hasn't, I was happy to pay more fees, but the board doesn't want to raise fees because some of these unit owners won't put up with it. So, I'm going to move out. I want to live in a condo that's got really the top condition. So then people that could have afforded to pay the higher fees and wanted to hire the nicer condition, they move out. The people that move in, by their very nature, the property isn't in quite as good a condition, but the fees were low. So then people say, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice a nicer property for the fees being low, so I'm going to buy a unit here. And then think about that. Now you've got more people living there that actually can't afford the true cost to live there because you're not funding that reserve. And that's what happens when we talk about the true cost of ownership. People that live in an association, they need to understand that true cost of living there, and that includes fully funding that capital, the reserve fund, because if you're not fully funding the reserve fund, someone down the road is going to pay for that. And what happens is, the way this vicious cycle works, home sale prices drop. People that are cost conscious are attracted to lower priced units. Again, the property condition has suffered, but the price is right, so they buy. Now you've got even more cost sensitive people living there, and they can't afford fee increases. But at some point, you have to increase those fees. Not only increase them to do these projects, but you have to increase them to make up for having not been funded properly for many years. So the property suffers, unit prices suffer, people buy that really are attracted to low fees and low units, but then when you need to replace the roof, all of a sudden now we're going to do a special assessment to replace the roof, and now you've got people living there who were attracted to low fees, attracted to the lower cost of unit, and they can't afford to pay that special assessment. And that makes it very difficult, puts some people in some very tough financial situations. So the truly compassionate thing to do for unit owners is to fully fund the reserve from as soon as you possibly can, whether it's from day one when the association turns over or as soon as you get that first reserve study, so that everybody that lives there understands the true cost of ownership. And if that true cost of ownership there is too high, I can afford my mortgage, I can afford the old monthly fee, but I couldn't afford the new monthly fee with the reserve contribution. I really need to think about getting moving somewhere more affordable, and let me get out of this unit while it's still in relatively good shape and get into something more affordable. And as a board, you want that because you want unit owners in there who can afford the true cost to live there, because that's that vicious cycle. The opposing way is having your cake and eat it too. You set your fees where they need to be so that you can maintain that property in top condition. The people are happy with the condition, they can afford to live there, they stay there. The people that go to look at to buy units, they say, hey, this is the association, here's the fees, it's in great condition, this is what the fees are, it's a true cost to live here, I can afford that, they buy, and then everything get higher resale prices, and that's a virtuous cycle that assists everybody. So I'm kind of just about at the half-hour point. Well, I'm at the half-hour point from when I started. So let's skip to the last, I think, yeah, there's one last slide I hear. So this is just real quick, other uses of the reserve study. Keep in mind, lenders, if the association is going to take out a loan, the association itself, they want to take out a loan for a capital project. We've got underfunded reserves and we need to do these big projects, the roof and the parking lot. We're going to take a loan from a bank and then pay that back over time. The lender to the association often wants to see the reserve study. Potential unit owners, you want to use the reserve study. Look, here's the fees we have here, but these fees are justified with the accurate reserve study. We've got our reserve plan in order. You're paying equitable fees here. You don't have to expect outrageous special assessments in the future. You should use that for potential buyers. And sometimes the disclosure packets include the reserve study. And I talked about this earlier as well when I talked about the realist part of the reserve mentality. Once you have the study done and you're actually doing these projects, you can use the information in the reserve study, that project-specific data, to help you benchmark your contractor bids, understand that. And then the engineering information that we put into the reserve studies, you can use that to extend the lives of assets. Hey, if we do this, this will last longer. So that falls into those other uses of the reserve study. So, so that's about a half hour there, and we want to take some time for questions and answers here. So, Mike, whatever I don't know if there's a place I should see these, but either way, if you read them off, and I can respond to those.
Yeah, so I didn't see any questions pop up in the chat, but if anybody does have questions, feel free to use the chat feature. We'll give it a couple of minutes here. So there was a lot of information to take in. There was quite a bit that Nick covered with his presentation.
And hopefully I wasn't talking too fast. That's my bad habit, is talking too fast. But
we're all guilty of it one way or another.
Oops, and now that I open the chat, I can see someone said, can I speak more slowly? So I should have had the chat open sooner.
It's okay, we have it recorded. We can slow you down a little bit. Well, if it doesn't look like anybody's using the chat feature, so we're just going to assume that everybody is oh, wait a minute. Got a couple of questions here. So from David, he wanted to clarify, should your association have two budgets, meaning one being operational, one being strictly reserves? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of, our expertise isn't on the operational budget, like your mowing and your maintenance and snow removal. So we don't understand those costs very well because that's not our expertise. So that's where associations have those operating budgets to deal with those. And then we are strictly that capital budget. So even your association fee, we're only giving you a part of that. And then either through your prior year's budget and baseline budgeting, or your um, uh, with the help of your management company to come up with your budget every year. That's that operational piece, and we're just giving you that capital piece.
Yeah, and one thing, David, if you talk with your manager, we do have the ability to run a separate set of financials for just reserves within our new software. So if you reach out to your property manager, they can give you a little bit more information on that, or one of your accountants. So that is an option where we could separate that from your main annual budget, and then you'll get two sets of financials in a sense, one being strictly the operating side, the other one being the reserve side. We had another question, Nick, from John. He wanted to know, well, I guess I'll kind of summarize it as, could you better explain what you mean when you said to be fully funded at 100%?
Yep. So, and I should clarify that because in that we do a cash flow based study, and that's what most of the country does is a cash flow based study. So cash flow means money in and money out. There's another type of study called the component analysis, another methodology called the component analysis. And if the component analysis is done, that's not looking at when the money actually comes in and goes out. So for the component method, fully funding, and that's a term that they use, fully funded. For a component method, you don't want to fully fund the reserve because you'd actually be overfunding it because you're not really looking at when the money comes in and goes out. Fully funding with a component method, you look back at your 30 years and say, wow, we always had this big amount of money in reserves we never dipped down into. So that's fully funding for the component method is overfunding, and even the people that do component method studies, they acknowledge that. The cash flow method is more accurate. So if you're doing a cash flow based study, it should be fully funded. If you're not, you're passing costs to a future. Now, you don't have to. There's no requirement to fully fund it. State of Wisconsin doesn't require it. Your decks and bylaws probably don't require it. So you can choose not to fully fund it. But if you're doing that, you are shifting the cost to someone in the future. And that's when you lose that equitable part, which is the core purpose of the study, is to have an equitable plan. And I see it, I can see the chat now. I see the other one here. How long does it take a study to conduct? What's a typical cost for a small association? 22 units, 2 buildings, if there's hallways. I mean, this varies by provider, but most studies fall between $3,000 and $5,000, but we do some big high rises, and those might be $10,000 studies. We do some huge HOAs, in Texas and things. I mean, you're talking to me here, I'm in New Berlin, but we do work across the country. Some big HOAs in Texas with 5,000 units and 3 different clubhouses and 3 different pools and huge, those you could be again like $10,000 studies, but most studies fall in the $3,000 to $5,000 range, and that's for 22 units with 2 buildings. I'd have to look at some other things. Age, do they have elevators or not? That falls into it, but you're probably between 3,000 and 4,000 for a building like that, if they based upon a few other parameters. I see John also says, what's an equitable percent for associations have funds on hand for present value costs? So present value cost isn't really how we, that's a different accounting term. Some people even talk about appreciation or depreciation. We're really looking at if we were to replace this asset in like kind, what would be the cost to do that? Because that's what people are enjoying and contributing amount for that. Here someone says, do you have to go on the roof to do the study? We do go on the roofs for a study. We bring ladders and go on the roofs. Unless a flat roof, we go up on through the hatch. And that gives us the ability to make much more subjective judgments instead of saying from the ground, hey, it's 20 years. There's things you can't see from the ground. Defects in the ridge cap shingles, unsealed nail heads, flashings, the tops and chimney caps. Those are all things you see from going up on the roof. John says, do you use actual cost of replacement or a national average? We're using local costs. I mean, we do thousands of studies, or have done thousands of studies, and then hundreds of studies in the local area. And so we look at those actual costs to see what we do use. There are databases that, like RS Needs, Marshall Swift, they publish costs by zip code. So those are companies that architects and engineers use when they build buildings and plan buildings, and they will use those costs by zip code. There's a lot of effort put into making sure those are accurate, but we still have our own observations of, look, we just did this property last year and we saw what the actual cost was for their roof replacement. And so we can tailor use of those numbers that we see in the RS means databases. But those are stratified by zip code, but then we have our own proprietary from our experience that we use as well. Let's see, then how much would an update study cost if it's been 2 years from the last study, and some upgrades made. So now we do updates differently. Typically in the industry, I usually see that updates are about 75% of the original cost of a study. I could go into a 15-minute screed about why we do updates differently, but we do updates just like a new study. We do a full inspection again because we're looking for these new assets, not just what's an average life for those, but how well installed were they? Is there anything that you might want to have a contractor come back under warranty? So we charge almost as much for an update as we did. There's a slight discount, but it's almost as much as the original study. So yeah, 2 years from the last study, see if you've got some of these big upgrades coming 2 years from the last study, we might even have a conversation when we're doing the study to say, hey, should we be including costs for upgrades if you're considering those, because that's only 2 years in the future. And again, that's different than something 8 years in the future. So again, something we consult with you on, but usually again, I'd see 3 to 5 years on the short term, but more like 5 to 7 years for many associations, unless they have done some really big upgrades. And those are usually the ones that go at that 4 or 5 year period, because those we didn't want to put the cost of an upgrade in when we did the original study, because people would be paying higher fees for too long when they weren't enjoying those upgrades. So I think that's all of them that I see so far.
Oh, we just got another one came in.
So
I'll let you. So the question was, what is a polite way to point out that there's an error in not properly funding the reserves over time from the previous board, which we do tend to see from board to board. You have some boards who don't necessarily think it's the priority of other boards that follow that reserve study 100%. So I guess kind of what is the most tasteful way that you could offer a suggestion on how to deal with that? And then also, could you potentially argue that for resale value, it's beneficial for the association to fund, which that's.
Yep, nope, I love this one, and I get this one a lot too. So great question, awesome question, because it comes up so many times. When you, for most people, if they understand that again, they're not paying for someone else's roof, then that negates some of that argument. But there are other people who say, look, I'm going to let, my kids are going to inherit my unit and they can deal with that when the time comes. But even for those, think about that. I mean, you don't want to, if someone truly understands that they're leaving an obligation for something else, there's not a lot of way to persuade that if they understand that that's what they're doing. But otherwise, you can point out to people that, the person who's taking your unit, they're obligated to pay the assessments, or they're going to lose the value of the asset. I mean, the association can foreclose an asset if assessments aren't paid. And so if there's a big special assessment out here, that's an obligation that you might be passing on to your heirs, whoever's going to acquire that unit if you pass. Or in the other instance, if someone's plans change, people might think they're going to live somewhere forever, but they decide, hey, I do want to move to Florida for health reasons and the weather or something, and then they do want to sell that unit, and resale suddenly does matter. So yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot. The first thing is to make sure that boards understand that, or unit owners understand that you're not paying for someone else's roof. And then the second thing is if they understand that their heir is going to be responsible for any special assessments and things, or lose the value of the unit to foreclosure to the association, and that's a big loss too, because if that asset has some equity in it, you'd want your heirs to capture that. But ultimately, this is my bias. I mean, I'll just be honest, many associations do the reserve study and they realize they need to increase their fees, but they aren't going to, they still don't increase them as much as the study says they should. So they are getting better funded. With that said, and this kind of like if you ask your dentist and say, hey, I really don't want to floss every day. I mean, your dentist isn't going to say, well, that's okay. I mean, that's my bias here. I'm not going to tell you it's okay not to fund your study to the level that the reserve study recommends, but I will tell you that very many associations don't. They use it to become better funded, and make that your goal, to become better funded over time. Many associations are underfunded. Most associations are underfunded. So it's a competitive environment for condos. Make sure that you're getting better funded, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years, all of a sudden, hey, we can fully fund the reserve study, and we're in a way better position than we were 10 years ago. And in the competitive environment, the condos understand that other companies are trying, other associations are trying to improve their funding as well. And so you want to make sure that you improve your funding position so that you're maintaining that competitive advantage. Detail how is a typical reserve study. Our reserve studies might be a brief property might be 70 pages. A very intense property with all kinds of assets might be 150 pages. And then there's a summary document that we pull out the main pieces of that. And those are probably about 5 to 6 pages, that summary version. So 10 pages for a reserve study, if that was the whole reserve study, is probably, that's so brief. I can't imagine being able to give you much information on the detail. I mean, you can certainly put in the funding plan and the expenditures forecast chart, but will there be any detail about the assets themselves, pictures of the conditions to justify the recommendations? 10 pages is pretty brief for a reserve study. And even in my experience, that would be a very brief study based upon what I've seen out there from, a handful of providers across the country in the Midwest. Here, Cindy said, I think this question was asked earlier, but do you have to go up on the roof to do a study? Again, we do go up on the roof. You don't have to go on the roof to do a study, but you can make a more accurate assessment of the roof's remaining life if you do go on the roof. Some roofs we don't go on. If we go up there and we see the shingles are much past their useful life, they're curled and cracked, we're not going to go on that roof because we don't want to crack the shingles walking on it. But in other instances, there's a lot to gain by going up on the roofs. And again, a flat roof where you can get hatch access from the inside of the building, go up on a flat roof. Those are usually gone on by us and by most providers go on those roofs. Don't see any others. Mike,
John just asked another question that at the end of the study, do you have a dollar amount that what does that study represent, as in the current value or the future value? Because I know how your studies are structured year over year. If you could comment on how that's being structured in the cumulative bill out.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but in the results of the study, we're giving you an annual contribution amount. So it's going to ultimately, it says you should be putting in, based upon all these expenditures that we projected, you need to be putting in $55,000 a year to the reserve study, and then there's an inflation factor for that. So 55,000 this year, next year 55,800, the following year 56,300. It grows for that inflation factor, and then that the association then divides that by the number of units based upon how they do it. They might do it by equal share for every unit, or some units, large units, pay a little bit more or something, but that's what we're giving people is that annual contribution. In some parts of the reserve study, we show the future replacement cost projections in today's dollars, current costs. In some parts of the study, we show the costs with inflation included. That's really into the weeds of how we display it in our actual reports, but there's a lot of logic there too to show the boards. They want to understand, look, we are today, so we want to be able to evaluate these costs in today's dollars, but when it is, we also want to understand that inflation is included and what's this project actually going to cost in future years. But the way that the study is created, inflation is only built into these costs by year as well. So you're not paying for a bunch of inflation that's for future costs. That's again an annual. And think about that. I mean, costs inflation is something that typically occurs on an annual basis. So it makes sense that there's a little bit of inflation in the reserve projections as well, even though you're not making that spend for a future year. And again, I don't know if that exactly answers the question. That's kind of I can see a number of different angles that he might be going with that question.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions, or are we all reserve study experts now? And we're all going to go out and do massive special assessments and bump those reserves up, right? No, let's not do that. So, all right, well, we'll give it another minute here. If anybody does have any questions, by all means, feel free to use the chat feature to ask.
Yeah, and also, I mean, especially for some of those more detailed questions, you could email me. Again, my email is Nik, N-I-K, @superiorreserve.com. My local number is 414-939-5689. So anybody could call and if you have questions. And I've usually got 10, 15 minutes to spare. If someone wants to get deep into reserve theory, we can chat about those as well. Email usually works best to start with, but some of these things are better discussed back and forth over the phone. So.
All right. Well, I think we have done a great job and there's no more questions. So Nik, thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us, and board members alike, thank you for taking a moment to learn a little bit more. Oh, Mike snuck in there with a question. So Mike asked, can your funding planner or your engineer will help adjust the recommended contribution based on projects completed in the last 2 years? So let's say you have an association does half of their roofs, and then would you adjust the reserve study on that, or would that be something included in your services that you guys would provide? Adjusting.
Yes. So if they've done some things differently than the reserve study initially had projected, they could either, if it's 2 years or less since the prior study, we can do an update without a site visit. And then sometimes if it's just one small change, we might even be able to make those. So it's kind of a case-by-case thing. We can talk about it with them and then let you know if sometimes it's a change we don't even need to charge it for. We can make those quickly. We do provide the spreadsheets with our studies that some associations put in the numbers themselves. But yeah, a couple different possibilities there.
Okay. All right, and then Nik, if you could, you mentioned that you did do that article for CAI. If you could, email that to us, and then we can send it out to all their participants of this conference call.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll get that taken care of probably tomorrow or Monday. Just depends when Kelly Wanderer can get to that. I know she's pretty busy with doing refinances right now. So
that sounds great.
All right. Okay, well, I think that's it. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. The next webinar we're going to do is the Spring and Summer Ready webinar. We haven't really quite finalized the name, but that will be sometime later towards the end of April. So thank you all. Everybody have a great night.
Have a great night, you guys.